So a few days ago I started talking about this article in the New York Times called "What If Age is Nothing But a Mindset?" And it talks about a psychologist named Ellen Langer has done some very interesting experiments. So the one that I talked about last time, I'm just going to quickly go over it. So there were some fellows that were in good health, but aging had left its mark. Before arriving, the men were assessed on measures such as dexterity, grip strength, flexibility, hearing and vision, memory and cognition. And they stayed for a week and at this place, and what they did, she calls it a counterclockwise study. And so these fellows were in this place, and they had it look like it was in the 50s, I think. 59, yeah. So everything looked like 1959, you know, the decorations, everything. It just looked like they stepped back in time. So that's the counterclockwise thing. And she had them really to think that they were in that time, to really immerse themselves in thinking that they were living in 1959. And so they were treated by everyone as if they were younger. They were told they would have to, you know, take their belongings upstairs, and, you know, even if they had one shirt at a time to do it, you know, because they, you know, they were older. So they discussed, you know, current events from '59. So, you know, Johnny Unitas, Wilt Chamberlain, the U.S. satellite launch, the first one, those kinds of things. They talked about movies that were current in '59. And they had no mirrors, no modern day clothing, no photos, except for portraits of themselves as much younger. And then at the end of the stay, the men were tested again, and on several measures they outperformed a control group that came earlier to this place but didn't imagine themselves back in their younger selves, even though they were encouraged to reminisce. So these fellows were suppler, showed greater manual dexterity, sat taller, but the most improbable was that their sight improved. So, and independent judges said that they looked younger. So it's like they put their mind in an earlier time and their bodies went along for the ride. And Langer said she thought it was just too good to be true. She, you know, thought, well, gosh, I don't know about this. And so she didn't really put it out there at that time because she thought it would be rejected. And it was a small sample study, you know, and it was just 5 days. There could have been many potentially confounding variables. So like the people wanting to try extra hard to please the testers, you know, many different things. So she just kind of left it be. And she didn't try to replicate the study because it was complicated and expensive. But then in 2010, the BBC broadcast a recreation of this called The Young Ones, with 6 aging former celebrities as the test subjects. And so these stars were taken to the place that they were going to be in period cars, and it was retrofitted to 1975, right down to wall art, the whole deal, just like Langer's group. And they also showed very marked improvement on test measures. One who rolled up in a wheelchair walked out with a cane. Another who couldn't even put his socks on and assisted at the start hosted the final evening's dinner party, gliding around with purpose and vim. The others walked taller and indeed seemed to look younger. They had pulled out of mothballs and made to feel important again, perhaps, is what Langer was thinking. So this program that they filmed, this study, was shown in 4 parts and nominated for like the equivalent of an Emmy here, called a BAFTA award. And so there was a lot more attention then to Langer's work. And Langer is a professor at Harvard. And let's see. And one of her colleagues said that she's one of the people at Harvard who really gets it. That health and illness are much more rooted in our minds and in our hearts and how we experience ourselves in the world than our models even begin to understand. And so this really is so much of a Buddhist mindset when you think about it, you know, that the power of the mind, that we rarely tap into the power of the mind. And I think these kinds of experiments kind of show what our potential is. Let's see. She did her work at, graduate work at Yale, and where she was in a poker game, and that led her to her doctoral dissertation on the magical thinking of otherwise logical people. She says even smart people fall prey to an illusion of control over chance events. She says we really aren't very rational creatures. Our cognitive biases routinely steer us wrong. And again, this is so Buddhist. I mean, this is what we are working with all the time. Langer's notion that people are trained not to think and are thus extremely vulnerable to right-sounding but actually wrong notions prefigured many of the tenets of behavioral economics and really followed the work of people like Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize in economic sciences. By the 70s, Langer had become convinced that not only are most people led astray by their biases, but they are also spectacularly inattentive to what's going on around them. They're just not there. Again, another Buddhist tenet that we really work with. When you're not there, Langer reasoned, you're very likely to end up where you're led. And this is something Venerable Children talks about all the time. You know, if we just watch the media and really don't think about what's being kind of fed to us, that we end up, you know, having those views and really living that way. So she set up a number of studies to show how people's thinking and behavior can easily be manipulated with subtle primes. In one, she and her colleagues found that office workers are far more likely to comply with ridiculous interdepartmental memos if they looked like other official memos. In another, created with her Yale mentor, Robert Abelson, they asked behavioral and traditional therapists to watch a video of a person being interviewed who was labeled either patient or job applicant, and then evaluate the person. The behavioral therapists regarded the interviewee as well adjusted regardless of whether they were told the person was a patient or an applicant. But the traditional therapists found the interviewee labeled patient significantly more disturbed. Even trained observers were mindlessly led by the label. So if people could learn to be mindful and always perceive the choices available to them, Langer says, they would fulfill their potential and improve their health. Langer's technique of achieving a state of mindfulness is different than the one utilized in mindfulness meditation, the non-judgmental awareness of the thoughts and feelings drifting through your mind. Her emphasis is on noticing momentary to momentary changes around you, from the differences in the face of your spouse across the breakfast table to variability of your asthma symptoms. When we are actively making new distinctions, rather than relying on habitual categorizations, we're alive. And when we're alive, we can improve. Indeed, well-being and enhanced performance were Langer's goals from the beginning of her career. Langer came to believe that one way to enhance well-being was to use all sorts of placebos. Placebos aren't just sugar pills disguised as medicine, though that's the literal definition. They are any intervention, benign but believed by the recipient to be potent. that produces measurable physiological changes. So placebo effects are a very powerful phenomena, and they're still not very well understood. But fields like psychoneuroimmunology and psychoendocrinology have merged to investigate the relationship between psychological and physiological processes. So for example, they're doing studies now where neuroscientists are charting what's going on in the brain when expectations alone reduce pain or relieve Parkinson's symptoms. And even more traditionally minded health researchers acknowledge the role of placebo effects and account for them in their experiments. But Langer goes well beyond that. She thinks they're huge, so huge that in many cases they may actually be the main factor producing the results. As an example, she points to a study she conducted in a hair salon in 2009. She got the idea from a study undertaken nearly a decade earlier by 3 scientists who looked at more than 4,000 subjects over 2 decades and found that men who were bald when they joined the study were more likely to develop prostate cancer than men who kept their hair. The researchers couldn't be sure what explained the link, but Langer's theory was baldness is a cue for old age, she said. Therefore, men who were bald early in life may perceive themselves as older and may consequently be expected to age more quickly. And those expectations may actually lead them to experience the effects of aging. To explore this relationship between expectations of aging and physiological signs of health, Langer and her colleagues designed a hair salon study. They had research assistants approach 47 women ranging from the age of 27 to 83 who were about to have their hair cut, colored, or both. They took blood pressure readings before they had anything done. After the subject's hair was done, they filled out a questionnaire about how they felt they looked, and their blood pressure was taken again. And in a paper published in 2010, they reported that the subjects who perceived themselves as looking younger after the makeover experienced a drop in blood pressure. So, very interesting. This is a good one too. A few years earlier, Langer and one of her students conducted a study published in the journal Psychological Science involving 84 hotel chambermaids. The maids had mostly reported that they didn't get much exercise in a typical week. The researchers primed the experimental group to think differently about their work by informing them that cleaning rooms was fairly serious exercise, as much as if not more than the Surgeon General recommends. Once their expectations were shifted, these maids lost weight relative to a control group and also improved on other measures like body mass index and hip to waist ratio. All the other factors were held constant. So the only difference was the change in mindset. And of course, critics hunted for other explanations, statistical errors or subtle behavior changes in the weight loss group that Langer hadn't accounted for. But it seemed like they couldn't find anything that would really be the explanation for this other than this change in mindset. And so I think maybe I'll stop here. There's a few more, but I'll stop here. And so when I read this, it just reminds me of really the whole Buddhist path, where we are continually looking at what our mind is thinking and what our behavior then becomes, and with this basis of being ethical and trying to be non-harming and to be kind, we continue to try and shift our expectation and shift our thinking patterns and then our behavior. And one of the barriers to do this is doubt. And so when you think about if we're doubting that we can really change, then we are putting a barrier up to our expectation that we can indeed transform our minds. So, and I think all this research that Langer is working with shows in a physiological way how this also plays out. And so I think to really open our expectations of ourselves and what we can actually accomplish, that we don't keep it so narrow and so closed, that we keep in mind that there isn't anything that we cannot transform internally if we put the Buddha's teachings to practice and let go of doubt and just continuing to show up, and sooner or later we will transform ourselves.